Hello everyone, I'm Vicky Lansbert, a real estate partner at White & Case, and I'd like to extend a very warm welcome from the firm to the second event of our Windows of Opportunity Spring webinar series. As you know, today's topic is global pharmaceuticals, new horizons in a post-COVID world, and I'm delighted to be able to introduce a panel of the caliber we have managed to assemble today. So firstly, I am delighted to introduce Sarah Neville, Global Health Editor for the Financial Times, who will be our moderator today. Sarah has been with the Financial Times for 20 years, working in senior editing and reporting positions, including Weekend News Editor, Analysis Editor, UK News Editor, Public Policy Editor, and Global Pharmaceuticals Editor. Now, handing over to Sarah, who will begin our discussions.
Thanks very much indeed, Vicky. Well, this is a perfect time for us to be having this discussion because it really has been the most extraordinary year for the pharmaceutical industry. It's been a year that's made heroes of many senior life sciences executives, and we're about to hear from one of them, Dr. Langer, as companies have pulled off the finding not one, but several highly efficacious vaccines against COVID-19 comfortably inside a year from the point at which the genetic code of SARS-CoV-2 was first sequenced. And that speed of discovery has beaten the previous fastest record for vaccine development by about 3 years. And it's not only vaccines. Work has also been going on apace to develop therapeutics and repurpose existing drugs to limit the effects of the disease. This turn of speed, shown by the industry and its regulators alike, has raised all sorts of interesting questions about how long-lasting these changes might be. Are we looking at a quantum leap forward in the industry's productivity, which has been in need of a boost for years, or will regulators and companies revert back to the old ways of doing things as the immediate spur of the crisis ceases to be felt? In an industry which was slower to seize on the advances of digital technology than many others, again in this past year we've seen a fascinating willingness to embrace new ways of doing things that holds promise for a future in which clinical trials can be made cheaper and more efficient. Many companies in these past few months of the pandemic have learnt the benefit of using digital monitoring of patients who, of course, were no longer able to get to a doctor's office or a hospital to be monitored as part of a clinical trial. And all of these developments hold out the promise not only of allowing the industry to go about its business more quickly and efficiently, but also offers, I think, a once-in-a-generation chance for the industry to rehabilitate its rather battered reputation in a way that could ease pressure for reform from the public and politicians alike. But even though leaders have emerged as the white knights of the pandemic, far more difficult questions are also starting to emerge about issues such as vaccine nationalism, which has started to come through as a rather ugly force, not of course in most cases of the industry's own making, but of national governments that have been looking to protect not only their vaccine supplies, but the equipment needed to administer them. And that in turn, I think, has reflected a broadly more protectionist mood about supply chains, which has emerged over this past year of the pandemic. A related risk is that the developing world may be left lagging badly behind more prosperous nations in the speed at which its populations can be vaccinated. Hard questions are also being asked now about whether companies should share more research, at least at the pre-competitive stage, in the public interest, and whether old attitudes to the sanctity of intellectual property must now be revised in the interests of getting breakthrough treatments to poorer nations faster. Closer to home, Brexit has also begun to raise difficult issues for the industry, which is going to have to shoulder additional costs if it's going to license and distribute its products in the UK and Northern Ireland markets. There's a clear risk that the industry may decide to reduce its investment in UK life sciences, unless it can be persuaded, perhaps by the promise of cheaper clinical trials using the expansive NHS dataset, or speedier approvals from our newly liberated national regulator, which of course is no longer part of the European regulatory system. To discuss all these extremely rich areas, I have with me a panel which Vicky has correctly described as extraordinary, and who I would now like to introduce. I'd like to start with Dr. Robert Langer. Dr. Langer is one of the institute professors at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, and being an institute professor is the highest honour that can be awarded to a faculty member. He's written over 1,500 articles, which have been cited over 336,000 times. His H in 86 is the highest of any engineer in history, and tied for the fourth highest of any individual in any field. His patents have licensed or sub-licensed to over 400 companies. He served as chairman of the FDA's Science Board, its highest advisory board, between 1999 and 2002, and he's been the recipient of over 220 prestigious awards, including both the United States National Medal of Science and the United States National Medal of Technology and Innovation. And he's one of only 3 living individuals to have received both those honours, as well as the Charles Stark Draper Prize, which is often called the Engineering Nobel Prize. Next, I'd like to come to Dr. Cone Burden. Dr. Burden works for the European Federation for Pharmaceutical Industries and Associations, where he is External Executive Director for International Trade, responsible for FPA's international cooperations, including in Russia, Turkey, China, and Japan, as well as Brexit and the EU-US relationship. He promotes a dynamic trade and investment agenda in support of innovation in general and for the pharmaceutical industry in particular. Next, I'd like to come to Keith Flanagan. Keith is the owner of Flanagan Strategies. He founded, built, and led the Office of Generic Drug Policy and the Office of New Drug Policy in the FDA's Drug Center, and before that he spent 8 years writing FDA laws on the US Senate Health Committee staff. Previously, he practiced corporate law at a global law firm. Then I'd like to introduce Anita Varma. Anita is chair of White & Case's Global Intellectual Property Practice Group. She's based in the firm's Boston office with a dual practice in London. She's qualified to practice before the US Patent and Trademark Office and the European Patent Office. Anita provides strategic patent counselling to life sciences industry companies, guiding them through every stage of a product's life cycle. Then finally, I'd like to come to James Killick. James has 25 years' experience of applying competition law in the pharma sector, including pleading many major cases in the European courts. He led White & Case's Pharmaceuticals and Healthcare Group from 2010 to 2014. Now, before I ask Dr. Langer to give us his presentation, I'd like to ask all of you, our audience, to take part in the first of several polling questions that we're going to be asking you. The first of these questions is, what should government and the pharma sector do before a new pandemic? And we've got a number of potential answers. Fundamental long-term research, better, more innovative regulation, keep a solid IP system, foster industry collaboration, more digital technology? And I'm going to leave you all to ponder that question now, and then I'm going to come back to your answers. But in the meantime, I would like to ask Dr. Langer to come forward as our first speaker, please. Dr. Langer.
Well, thank you so much. Can people hear me okay? Thank you. So anyhow, I thought I'd try to tell you a little bit about my own work, and then to give an example, which is how Moderna got started. If we could go to the first slide. So basically, I got my degree. This is the timeline slide. I got my degree from Cornell as an undergraduate, and then my doctorate from MIT. But then, and I'm a chemical engineer. But when I got done, I did something that was very different for a chemical engineer at that time. Almost all chemical engineers then went to the oil industry, and I wasn't excited about that. And I decided, and I ended up getting a job at Boston Children's Hospital, and I was actually the only engineer there. And I was doing really basic work on cancer biology. But one of the key things that I was doing, I was working with a man named Judah Folkman, and he had this idea that if you could stop blood vessels, you could stop cancer. It was a very controversial theory, but basically, what he wanted me to do was to prove it, and in so doing, isolate the first of these inhibitors. But to do that, it was kind of hard because you had to be able to study these things, and these molecules were quite large, and so in 1976, I published with him, which showed that this was possible. I should point out that before this, everybody told him and me that it wasn't possible, and the literature also said it wasn't possible. I'll get to that in a minute. And I should finally point out that when I published this work, there was enormous skepticism and ridicule. For example, if we could just go to the next slide, when I first presented it, and I was pretty young then, I was like 26, 27 years old. I presented it at a meeting, and all these senior scientists told me that what I was saying made no sense, that these molecules that I was doing couldn't get through solid materials any more than any of us could walk through a wall. They also said that the organic solvents that I was using would destroy whatever we put in, and some of the large molecules we put in were peptides, proteins, and also nucleic acids. Nucleic acids include RNA and DNA, which I'll get to later. But in fact, our Nature paper was the first time any of these had been put in a tiny material like a nanoparticle or a microparticle and shown to be able to come out. At any rate, just for my own career, because of this enormous skepticism, I tried to get research grants, but my first 9 were rejected. I tried to get a faculty position in a chemical engineering department, because that was my home discipline, and no chemical engineering department in the world would hire me. So I ended up getting a job in a nutrition department, and the reason I think I got it was the guy who was head of the department. He was kind of what I'd call a benevolent dictator kind of department head, and he liked me, and he offered me this job, but he didn't bother to ask anybody else in the department what they thought, which still might have been okay, except for one thing, which was the year after I joined the department, he left. So a lot of the senior faculty decided to give me advice, and they said I should leave too. In fact, on the next slide, this was from one of my good friends, Mike Marletta, who's a very famous chemist. He at Berkeley, he was once head of their department. He was speaking about what it was like to be with me in 1980, and what he was saying was that generally the agent to be released is a very relatively small molecule with a molecular weight no larger than a few hundred. He said one would not expect that macromolecules could be released because of their extremely small permeation rates. In other words, the same thing, like you couldn't get through them. However, Folkman and myself reported. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I was going to the next slide. But anyhow, he said when the older scientist heard my concepts for drug delivery, he blew a cloud of smoke in my face and said I better start looking for another job. So anyhow, that wasn't very good. That they all wanted me to leave, but I was kind of stubborn and I kept working on it. And one of the things that Dr. Folkman said to me was that we should file for a patent. So And at Boston Children's Hospital, we never had a patent, so we filed for the first time. But 5 years in a row, the patent examiner rejected it. So the head of the hospital told me that I should just give up because that we were never going to get the patent. But I don't like to give up. And as I told you before, everybody was telling me when I started this that this was impossible. It couldn't work. So I wondered, did anybody ever write that down? So as I mentioned to you, we wrote this paper in Nature in 1970, and I wondered, did anybody ever cite it? So you can do what's called a science citation search. By the way, this is often a good patent tip. So I did this to see what people wrote about it, and I found next slide. If we could go to the next slide. So basically, what five of the this was so I did the search in 1982 after about 5 years of rejection, and I found this quote from 5 of the top chemists in the world, and they wrote describing this field in a review article that generally the agent to be released is a relatively small molecule. One would, with a molecular weight no larger than a few hundred, one would not expect that macromolecules like proteins or nucleic acids or things like that could be released by such a technique because of their extremely small permeation rates. However, Folkman and myself have reported some surprising, so that's a very good word for a patent examiner, some surprising results that clearly demonstrate the opposite. So and the next slide just shows that what happened was basically when I found that, the people at the hospital showed it to the examiner. They flew down to Washington and they showed it to him, and he said, "Gee, he had no idea that that was the case." He said, "If Dr. Langer, if I could get each of these 5 people to write affidavits that they really wrote that, he would allow the patent." So I did. I wrote them, and they were all nice enough to write me back. They really wrote it, and we got this very, very broad patent. And with that patent, it's interesting. I was very excited about it. I got asked by a couple of multi-billion-dollar companies if I would consult for them, which I did. And I mentioned that we had this patent, and they said, "Well, we want to license it." And one was in animal health, another in human health. So we did, and I got a grant, and I got a consulting fee, and I was most excited that they were going to develop it. But what happened is that they worked on it for a little while, but then they kind of gave up because the things didn't work right as well as they wanted right away. So they gave up, and then about a year or two later, Alex Klebanoff, one of my colleagues at MIT, said, "Bob, we should start our own company." So we started this little company with 4 of my as the first 4 people were my own students who'd worked on this. The next slide just depicts a little bit of that. And what we did is we started it with my students. We did this merger with a company. We were on the 5th floor of a building, and there were another company, Alchemy's, on the 4th floor, and they had a really good CEO, but their technology wasn't working. And so what we did is we did a merger with them, and today they have something like 25 products in clinical trials or actually being used, and it's led to new treatments for schizophrenia, alcoholism, opioid addiction, diabetes, affecting millions of people. And we also licensed the patent or sub-licenses to other people, other companies, taught other companies. Today, on the next slide, what you see are all kinds of products based on that. And I won't go through all of them, but there are many different ones, little substances that you would inject underneath the skin that could deliver drugs, drug-eluting stents, which are widely used, different eye disease products, and so forth. So then we kept on doing this, and like I said, there were a lot of products, but I kept academically always looking for the next challenge that we could meet. And when you inject these particles underneath the skin, they can deliver a drug. But if you wanted to, say, get them to a cell, inject them in the bloodstream, they're eaten up quite quickly. So next slide.
He starts with a nanoparticle of anti-cancer drug. That gets encased in a plastic that releases the drug over time. That, in turn, gets a special wrapping that disguises the package as a water molecule to fool the body's immune system. And last but not least, the address where it should be delivered, a key that will only fit the lock of cancer cells.
So we originally did do that for cancer, but what I was going to say is that, and that was a video that Nova, the TV show, did on my work. They came to film me, but I like that cartoon because they explain it so much better than I do. So what we did is we made nanoparticles. We coated them with something called polyethylene glycol, and they would last longer. What this next slide shows is that, we published that in Science, 27 years ago, and that paper has been cited many, many thousands of times, and it's widely used on all kinds of nanoparticles. Then in 2001, some of my colleagues, and they asked me to be on the scientific advisory board, we started a company called Alnylam to deliver siRNA. And that will become important because, as I'll mention, they got an approval to deliver siRNA, short interfering RNAs, in 2018. We also published papers showing how you could make nanoparticles by using what's called microfluidics. That's on the top right. And that's what's going to be used today by Moderna and other companies, microfluidics, to make the billions of nanoparticles and manufacture them. And then on the bottom right, we also, with Dan Anderson and Kenna Kink, we developed this idea of lipid libraries. And that also has become important for making a lot of these lipid nanoparticles. At any rate, as I mentioned, next slide, on Patro, and this was kind of, I think, a landmark thing that got approved in 2018 to treat a rare disease, ATTR amyloidosis. And like I say, this is siRNA in lipid nanoparticles. Now, in 2010, going back now, Derek Rossi, a young scientist, came to see me, and he and I and Ken Shen and Nubar Afeyan wanted to see if we could not only deliver siRNA, but messenger RNA. Just to go over this, if we could go on the next slide, which is the central dogma of molecular biology, the idea is that you have DNA makes RNA make proteins. And I'm sure you all know that there have been many, many companies like Genentech and Amgen that have become very successful by making proteins. But it may take a year or so because it's a giant manufacturing plant, and you have to purify stuff and everything else. But what if you could do RNA? If you could just take RNA and inject it into the body, it could make a protein too, though you need to deliver it right. But the body's the factory. So rather than spend a year, you could probably do it in a few weeks. Not only might you be able to make proteins, but you could also, if you could get into a cell, which again you could maybe do with these nanoparticles, next slide, you could treat intracellular diseases. So you could treat all kinds of diseases that you could never treat before. So with that idea, the four of us started Moderna. Next slide. And just to sort of tell you some of the history of Moderna, it was founded in 2010 with flagship investing about $1 million. But then we got more equity from different places in 2012. AstraZeneca, we did this big deal with them in 2013, where we got $280 million for heart disease, plus $180 million in milestone payments, plus royalties. And that's very exciting. That's in phase 2 trials today. We also had deals with Alexion and Merck for different things. And on the next slide, just to continue, the first patient was dosed in 2016. Some more deals were done. Some more equity was raised. In 2018, we did the largest public offering of any company in history. And then today, we have 14 products in clinical trials. And as people probably know, the COVID-19 vaccine is approved. We have about 1,300 employees. Now, I should point out that we did all this. Moderna has been widely criticized going all along. I personally think it was jealousy, but the press was always very, very critical of Moderna. A lot of scientists said this would never work, just like they told me the things that I was doing would never work. Some of you may know there's this spinoff of the Boston Globe called STAT, which to me kind of, anyhow, I'll just show us a couple slides. We have a fantastic CEO at Moderna, Stefan Bancel, and what they wrote, a very negative article about it. This is several years ago about ego, ambition, turmoil inside of one of biotech's most secretive startups. On the next slide, the STAT also wrote, it's actually the same guy, Damien Gard, who I think doesn't like us very much. He says, well, Moderna, unable to press forward with their technology, Moderna has had to focus instead on developing a handful of vaccines, turning to a less lucrative field that might not justify the company's nearly $5 billion valuation. I should point out today it's a $70 billion valuation, so I don't think he was right. Anyhow, then he continues to say vaccines are not nearly as lucrative as the rare disease space that Moderna hoped to dominate. Actually, Moderna was working on many different things, but the market is also much more crowded. At least 7 Zika vaccines, for instance, are either in clinical testing or expected to enter testing by next fall. Other journals also were kind of negative. For example, in the next slide, they're comparing Moderna to Theranos and Elizabeth Holmes. And on the next slide, this is our local paper, the Boston Globe, and this is actually less than a year ago. They're basically saying about how this is not how you do science, with a picture of me, which was very disappointing that your hometown paper is going to do that. And then also a stat again, next slide, basically is saying that vaccine experts say Moderna didn't produce data critical assessing COVID-19 vaccine. So this kept going on and on, all last year, enormous criticism of Moderna. Nonetheless, I mean, as history has shown, we published papers in New England Journal. There's really staggering good data. I mean, 95% of the people that get this vaccine, there's 90, if you take a flu vaccine, it's 50%. Here you get 95%, and it's 100% of people that don't have to go to the hospital, which I think is absolutely been remarkable. A picture of it is just shown on the last slide. In terms of just showing that, that's just a picture. In fact, hopefully there was an announcement even this morning that Moderna hopes to make 3 billion doses over the next year to help not only the United States, but the entire world. So what do you take away from this? Well, I hope that you see that it's really, I think, very important to dream about things that a lot of people think that are impossible. I think it's also important to persevere, that if you try to do big ideas, that you're going to get a lot of criticism. And I think sometimes maybe you can even turn that criticism into patents, as I mentioned. But you're certainly going to get a lot of criticism. I certainly have over the years. But to me, it's worth it, because I think the good that can come out of this, and I think the good that's come out of what I basically did at MIT and what we've done at Moderna, can have a huge impact on society. And it's not just COVID, it's many other things that Moderna is doing, and many other things that our own lab's doing. For example, half our lab has been devoted to working with the Gates Foundation to try to develop new ways of giving nutrition, new ways of giving drugs, new ways of creating vaccines for the developing world, which again will affect, I hope, billions of people. So I think all these things are important. To me, as I listened to the question that was asked in the beginning, I think you want to do all those things that were mentioned. I think you want to support basic research. You want to realize that no big company created this vaccine, right? I mean, the 3 leading companies producing vaccines are by far are Moderna, BioNTech. I mean, it's not Pfizer. They basically made a deal with BioNTech, and CureVac. And then there's some other small companies. No big company was willing to take that risk. I mean, they basically felt like all these, the newspaper things, they maybe believe it because they were conservative. So I think it's really important that that people can have innovation, and that you can get, these little companies started. And it's not easy to do it. It takes a lot of funding. It takes, people are working 24/7 at Moderna and at MIT because they want to do good for the world. So at any rate, I'm honored to be able to give this talk to you. I'm certainly happy to answer any questions if I can. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much, Bob. That's absolutely fascinating. What a wonderful sort of paean to the power of persistence. And I really am intrigued by your point at the end, that it's actually been the biotechs that have been the real movers and shakers in developing the COVID vaccine. It hasn't been the big pharma companies by and large. So that's great. And I think actually, before we move on to the next phase of our panel discussion and bring everybody else in as well, and I'd like to ask the question which follows very directly from what Bob has been telling us about, which is how do we ensure the rapid development of drugs and vaccines? Bob, I guess what you've just described to us was a kind of a marathon followed by a sprint in terms of the development of the mRNA technology. But who'd like to kick off on that? Cone, perhaps I could come to you and ask you for your thoughts about how we ensure that this extraordinary rapid timetable we've seen with the COVID vaccines can be replicated more widely for other medicines in future.
Yeah, thanks, Sarah, and great to be on the panel. I think that's a very important question. It's really key because, of course, one of the things that we know for sure is we don't know when or in what form any next pandemic would hit. That is the level of uncertainty we are faced with and we have to deal with. So I think it is key to try to be as prepared as possible for what we don't know exactly where it's coming from and how. So in general, I think there are sort of a few elements that I think would be part of the way in order to speed up the development of drugs, treatments, medicines in order to tackle the next pandemic. I would say an overall strong innovation climate is really imperative because from the story we just heard, we also understand that there have been long-term trends that have led to necessary technologies that are now extremely useful. And as you said, Sarah, the sprint is important. So you need a strong IP system. You need a strong innovation climate. You can't just turn innovation on and off with the click of a button. It's either on for a long term and a driver, or it is not. I think the second part is that it's really key to have a strong and fast regulatory system that is in a strong cooperation mode when you have a pandemic like this, to make sure that you have rolling reviews of let's say, potential vaccines, but also in the longer term that you think about what are new techniques, that you're open to new techniques like ATMPs or like gene therapies. I think a good example is antimicrobial resistance, for example. We know that is a challenge that's going to come, and strong incentives for research today will help us to prepare in the longer run. A final short comment from my side would be, I think, open and resilient global supply chains to adjust and adapt to crisis hit in a flexible way is a third element I would find important. I'd like to leave it at that, Sarah.
Thanks very much, Cone. Keith, perhaps I could come to you next. You've been on the front line of drug regulation. What lessons would you take from what we've seen in the past year and how replicable that's going to be going forward?
Well, first, I know, Bob, that unfavorable press always stings, but as a patient, thank you for your scientific leadership and courage, because we're here because I'm vaccinated because you didn't care that someone blew cigar smoke in your face and mocked you. So thank you. In the United States and FDA cleared in the therapeutic space maybe over 400 studies of potential COVID therapeutics, and the result was a vast majority of trials were small and unlikely to lead to actionable findings. So you're going to see a push to improve the clinical trial infrastructure, and in particular, embed research more into clinical practice, more into the community. And the community, as some folks have alluded, point of care means something different now a little bit than it did prior to the pandemic. And there will be decentralized trials and wearables and other such tools.
Yes. Can you hear us? Hello? Yes, that's very interesting, point, actually, the spread of wearables. Perhaps it's been a sort of coming of age for that kind of technology, the pandemic. I mean, Bob, do you have any other thoughts than you've already shared with us about how the regulatory environment needs to change? You managed to get approval very speedily, much more speedily than would normally happen for your clinical trials, and then of course for the vaccine itself. How? I mean, do you think that was a kind of a one-off? It was because of this enormously intense period we were living through and the urgency, or do you think some of those lessons will stick with regulators?
Well, I think when there's a crisis, and there have been other crises, certainly not like this, but you go back to the AIDS situation, things can change. I personally think that the FDA and other regulatory agencies, I think they're really important. And I think having them have more people, having them have more time to, when I was chair of the FDA Science Board, I mean, a lot of them wanted the opportunity to do research, to go to conferences so they'd be up to date, as up to date as possible. So I think just further support for regulatory agents and what I'll call regulatory science, that's something that some of the people like Janet Woodcock at the US FDA have felt is important. I think that those kinds of things would certainly help. And I think, certainly the issue of having a sense of urgency and doing things faster is important. You also want to do them right. And that's why having more support for FDA kinds of things, in my opinion, would be useful.
Mm. So you found that certainly the FDA was flexible in its approach and was able to evaluate your technology, even though it was a novel technology, essentially. I mean, obviously, as you explained to us, you've been working on it for many years. But did you find by and large that people at the FDA were able to understand and appreciate its novelty and evaluate it?
Absolutely, and I feel like the FDA has been sometimes very good that way. Like they fast track things anyhow. I mean, that are often cutting edge science. So I feel like that's been a real positive. That doesn't necessarily mean they'll approve things, but they'll do it faster when it's something novel. So a lot of the time, so I think that's been a very good thing. But they certainly understand it. Yeah, I mean, certainly they understood this.
And Anita, could I come to you? Cohn mentioned the importance of a strong IP system, but of course, there's been some pressure, hasn't there, in recent months for companies to perhaps relinquish some of the control over their IP. There's started to be a debate around the idea that large companies should serve them. Could I come to you and ask you about the IP climate? Cohn alluded to the need for a strong IP system, but of course there's started to be a debate, hasn't there, in the last few months about whether companies should be more willing to relinquish control over their IP in the interests of getting breakthrough medicines faster to poorer nations, and perhaps a willingness to out-license more. What's your perception of how the thinking around IP may have been changed by the pandemic?
So I feel that if anything, this pandemic has shown the need for a stronger IP system and the fact that two points. One, how do we, and Bob raised this, how do we bring technologies to the marketplace? I think that's something for us to really consider. In Bob's slides, he had said that when Moderna started in 2010, they started with a funding of seed financing of 1 million. They got to 40 million, right? If we juxtapose that with the cost for bringing drugs to market, I think on the last count, it was about 2.5 billion. So how do biotechs get from 40 million being able to successfully commercialize, right, if the cost is 2.5 billion? It happens through collaborations, and it happens through VC financing and funding. And all of that, one of the key factors that supports all of that collaboration is patents, right? When VCs are looking at companies, biotechs, they're looking at the strength of the patents. So I feel that, yes, there is this, in the context of the pandemic, there is a lot of push to set aside patents, but we cannot lose sight that it is the smaller biotechs that are bringing up new technologies, that are bringing us these new therapies, and how do we get them to market. And the second piece I would say is it's important to actually see how has the life sciences companies kind of reacted to the pandemic, right? Although there is a lot of questioning about patents being an impediment, I haven't, to vaccine distribution, I really haven't seen evidence that supports that it is patents that are the impediment. Manufacturing, scale-up issues, there are supply chains, there are a lot of other issues, but I haven't seen any support for the argument that patents have been an impediment. In fact, it's quite the opposite. What you're seeing is collaboration in the industry. You're seeing collaboration between competitors, Merck and J&J, for example. I think the BioNTech, Pfizer, I believe Novartis and Sanofi are opening up their manufacturing facilities. So there is no evidence that says that, licenses are not available. Moderna has made a patent pledge saying that they will not enforce their patents during the pandemic. So despite there being a lot of reaction to the fact that maybe patents should be set aside, before we take such drastic action, I think we should really examine, do the facts really support that, setting aside patents? To me, that is a very drastic action. Before we take some actions like that, you really have to kind of weigh and balance that. So I'll kind of leave it at that.
That's fascinating. Yes. Bob, do you have any reflections on that from your point of view?
Yeah, I completely agree. I mean, you wouldn't have any of these vaccines were it not for patents. I mean, investors, like I say, they all of these three companies that are the leaders, and even if you look at the ones behind them, all of them are backed by investors, who took chances, who took, by venture capitalists or other people that took chances. And if they felt that anybody could do it, they would never have made the investment. So, I mean, so many, if it weren't for, like I say, Moderna, BioNTech, I imagine CureVac and other companies like Translate Bio, who also venture backed. I mean, every single one of them is venture backed. And like I say, venture capitalists wouldn't put money in, they'd put it into more Facebooks, which they do anyhow. I mean, but that would be even more. So, an investor has a choice. Do they want to invest in Facebook or do they want to invest in something like this? So, I mean, the consequence, in my opinion, of not having this funding, of not having patents, would be you'd have zero Modernas, BioNTechs, and CureVacs, and billions of people would have been dead. And unfortunately, and what Anita said is right. I mean, Moderna they've filed the patents, but in a crisis like this, they're open for the whole world to use because we said we're not going to enforce them. So I think patents are absolutely essential. You'd have none of these companies and probably a lot more Facebooks.
Really powerful. Yes, I know which I'd choose between those two. James, could I come to you? I mean, Cone touched on the issue of how we fund research and how it needs to be supported, particularly perhaps research that doesn't have an immediate prospect of commercial return. Do you have any thoughts about, again, what we might have learned during the past year about the importance of, perhaps more public funding, more government funding for basic scientific research?
Well, I think Dr. Langer's talk showed just how important it is to have public funding of basic research. I mean, if you imagine you had an engineer sitting in a children's hospital, doing fundamental research, that is the definition of kind of innovative public funding. It's a very interesting example. I think in addition to that kind of funding basic research, which is very important, I think the other thing the pandemic has taught us is that, if we want to be ready for a crisis, we need to build capacity in advance. It's like in the electricity system. we always pay some power stations to be on standby for the day that something else breaks, or when we suddenly have huge demand. And I think in the pharmaceutical area, we need to think about the same kind of approach, so that if there is another crisis, we're more ready. We've got organized. I think the other thing that's very important is that competitor collaboration has been exemplary during this pandemic. Lots of people who are normally rivals have got together for the greater good, and that's been very good to see. And as an antitrust lawyer, what's been impressive is that the antitrust regulators have said, please go ahead. You have to be careful tomorrow, but today we're happy for you to collaborate. We're happy for you to go ahead and pool resources, pool production, collaborate on API support, API sourcing, to try and make things move forward faster in this emergency situation. So, lots of lessons there for the future.
That's fascinating. And Keith, I think you wanted to come back on that.
Just a very quick comment. I agree about building the infrastructure so it's there when you need it. If there's efforts to modernize the clinical trial infrastructure, you could use it for a lot of unmet needs in the common chronic disease space, and then it would be ready when you needed it.
You're talking there about manufacturing infrastructure or
clinical trials infrastructure?
Clinical trials, right? Yes. Were you thinking there of infrastructure in terms of sort of digital monitoring, or what would make the difference, do you think, in having a sort of
just
go?
Embedding research more into ordinary clinical care instead of having it be diffuse and more of an academic exercise.
That's fascinating, and I think it's what we've very much seen here in the UK with the recovery trial.
Right.
Which has been massively effective in running a very rigorous randomized controlled trial in the very midst of a pandemic, through using the network of NHS hospitals and the willingness of doctors and patients to participate. I think that's a great example, isn't it, of what you're saying. And Cone, did you want to come back in?
Thanks a lot. I think James referred to something very interesting, and I just want to build on that. I think the one point that is also very useful is to look further into what we call the public-private partnership programs. For example, you have the Innovative Medicines, now the Innovative Health Initiative, which basically combines societal needs, the question of where fundamental research or where questions need to be answered from a perspective of society, with the joint efforts of industry and government. So I think this, for example, IHI initiative is a very useful one to look at. For example, there is a program which is called CARE, and CARE stands for Corona Accelerated R&D in Europe. It basically looks at the more fundamental reasons, combining private companies and the other public stakeholders into looking at some of these issues. So I would say that's also part where I think government cooperation, dialogue with industry is really important, taking things forward.
That's really interesting, and perhaps some of the groundwork for that has been laid in the past year more than it has in the past. So, we've talked quite a bit about what lessons we have learned from the past year. I mean, do people have thoughts about precisely what we need to do and achieve before the next crisis hits? Without wishing to be too pessimistic, this may not be the last pandemic that we see in our lifetimes. And I guess in many ways the world was caught somewhat napping, wasn't it, ahead of this one, in everything from the strength of our public health infrastructure to the capacity we had for manufacturing vaccines at scale. Does anybody have thoughts they'd like to pitch in on how we need to prepare now for the next the next crisis. Anybody want to kick off on that one? I don't know. Keith, thoughts?
I think that the factors that we listed above, having a vibrant, creating a vibrant pro innovation, pro investment, pro research infrastructure is critical. I agree with all the other commenters on that.
James, do you have any further thoughts on that?
Well, I think, I mean, the thing that strikes me as not as a lawyer rather than a medical person is that, you know, investments in public health, you know, investments in getting people's health better generally, you know, are very much worth the effort. You see that people with comorbidities have suffered far worse in this crisis. Now, there's lots we can do to improve public health generally, which I think, you know, it's sometimes viewed as not a very good investment, but I think that's wrong. You know, investing in public health as a government is a good investment, and I think that would be one thing to do before the next crisis to get our population in better shape to start with, and then they'll have a better outcome.
Yes, indeed. I mean, the other thing I wanted to explore a bit more, perhaps, is the slightly sort of protectionist mood that seems to have arisen around supply chains and determination. You know, vaccine nationalism. We touched on it earlier. I mean, how big a threat do you think that is to the way in which the world needs to respond to the next pandemic? And obviously, we're still very much in this one. Cone, do you have thoughts from the FPA perspective?
I mean, I think this is a very correct observation, and I think this is an area for concern. I mean, if you look at vaccinations, you know that the world isn't safe until a large share of the entire global population is vaccinated. Yeah, I think that's a key element. When you talk about global supply chains, if you look at how the pharmaceutical industry operates, even the example of the Pfizer-BioNTech vaccine, it uses 280 ingredients produced in 87 factories coming from 19 different countries in order to get the final product that we all need. So I think there is indeed a big concern that these sort of protectionist tendencies are gaining ground, and I think that is the wrong direction to go. Naturally, governments are concerned about their own resilience, their own strategic resilience questions, and you see that in the United States, you see that in Europe, you see that in China, you see that in other countries. But the whole, I think, challenge is that while resilience sounds very appealing for one country, if you add them all up, it doesn't add up in total. It should much more be about strengthening and diversifying supply chains, not about the questions on protectionism and autarky, because the EU exports are the United States or Chinese imports. So when you reduce those imports, you reduce exports, and in the end, that's a lose-lose game. You hear discussions about reshoring supply chains. If, for example, the EU were to reshore its supply chains, apart from the cost implications, I think if others would follow, more supply chains would leave the EU than the EU could possibly reshore back into the European Union. We also looked at these kind of things from a statistical perspective. For example, for the European Union, 77% of APIs come from Europe itself. There are numbers circulating that this would be 80% coming from China. That's factually not correct. And I think that's another element that it's really important to sort of base these discussions on the empirical facts. And a very interesting study done by the OECD last year also showed that the agility and flexibility an economy has to respond to a global pandemic is massively increased if you have a global interconnectedness, because a pandemic may hit globally in worst case like it does today, but even then it doesn't hit each country at the same time. So you have a time phasing that leads to flexibilities and agility as well. And I really want to say that I think that open, resilient supply chains are vital for an agile response to a future pandemic.
Fascinating. Would anybody else like to share reflections on that? No one else wants to pitch in. We're sadly reaching very near to the end of our time, but I'd just like to throw out one final question, which is, do people feel that this, I touched on it earlier in my opening remarks, that this could be a moment for the industry to really burnish its reputation in a lasting way? Do people think that we are looking at an opportunity for the industry to move away from some of the negativity that we'd seen in the last few years, suggesting it was price gouging, people not being willing to at all to see the industry the way the industry I know sees itself, as a bunch of people who only get up in the morning to find breakthrough medicines and make life better for patients. But that's not the way that it's been widely seen. But is that going to change now? I've probably literally got time for one person to give me thoughts on that. Anybody got a burning desire to come in? Keith, you go for it.
Yes, of course, everyone gives credit to industry for the extraordinary accomplishment of producing the vaccines and therapeutics and diagnostics so rapidly. At the same time, there's some sentiment that some medicines in the United States, gene therapies, rare disease treatments, are priced very high. And there's some sentiment that the United States is cross-subsidizing the rest of the world. So it will be, drug pricing is going to continue to be a hot topic legislatively in the United States.
Regardless of the achievements of the last year, yes. Well, look, on that note, it just remains for me to thank you all for a splendid discussion and to hand back to Vicky for closing remarks.
Thank you so much to everyone for joining us this afternoon, and to our esteemed panel for their fascinating contributions to the discussions. We hope that you also may be able to join us for our future webinars, which are part of this Windows of Opportunity series. They are going to be on battery storage, on SPACs, that being special purpose acquisition companies, and also on carbon and climate change. All of our future webinar series will be advertised through our webpage, www.whitecase.com/opportunity 2021. Thank you all once again very much for joining us.